Judith Meese. I'm the current president of Division 15. And it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Slavin to be a featured speaker for our division. Dr. Slavin has done extensive work in the area of educational reform, which makes him an ideal candidate for this year's theme for our division, which is Speaking Research to Power. Dr. Slavin has had and continues to have a very distinguished career in educational research, and he's one of the very few who has taken an educational innovation to scale. And I just learned, I knew that Dr. Slavin had one I3 grant. He actually has 3 I3 grants now out in the field, and we'll be talking about some of that research. I met Dr. Slavin when I was an early career researcher. I was a postdoc at the Learning Research and Development Center, and there was a conference there on social relations in the classroom. And that's when I was first exposed to some of the work that Bob was doing on cooperative learning in the classroom and how that can promote intergroup relations. At that time, in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, a lot of the cooperative learning research was focused on helping with desegregation and enhancing intergroup relations in the classroom. And of course, he's extended that to how you can use cooperative learning activities to promote academic skills, in particular reading and math, right? And math as well. Dr. Slavin is currently the director of the Center for Research and Reform in Education at Johns Hopkins University, and he's also an adjunct professor at the Institute for Effective Education at the University of York in England. He received his BS from Reed College and his PhD in social relations from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Slavin is a very prolific writer. I don't know when he sleeps. He has authored or co-authored more than 300 articles and chapters on topics such as cooperative learning, comprehensive school reform, ability grouping, school and classroom organization, desegregation, mainstreaming, research reviews, and evidence-based reform. Dr. Slavin has also authored or co-authored 24 books, including a very popular educational psychology textbook. Over his career, Dr. Slavin has received numerous prestigious awards and honors, including an early career award from the American Educational Research Association and a Distinguished Service Award from the Council of Chief of State and School Officials. Recently, Dr. Slavin was appointed as member of the National Academy of Education, and he is an AERA Fellow. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Slavin to the podium. His talk today is called Evidence-Based Reform in Education.
Well, thank you for a very kind introduction. Glad to see you all here. Especially I was thinking back to my first presentation at an AERA conference, which was in 1976. And this was in Washington, and they gave me one of those horrible rooms way down in the basement of the Washington Hilton. And only 4 people showed up. And one of them was my mother. I grew up in Washington. So I'm glad at least to see that we filled out the audience just a tad. I'm going to talk to you about something that, for those of you who are going to be in this field for many years, are going to find more and more central to your work and to your thinking about what are you trying to achieve in your role as pragmatic researchers in education. I think a good way to start this off is with a story, true story that was told to me about, or assumed it's true, told to me by a friend who had been the president of a large publishing company. And one year, they put a lot of money into creating a new high school biology text. And they called in all kinds of experts in biology and tried to take into account everything that was known about how adolescents learn biology, and really, took seriously what the wisdom of the field was in terms of how to teach this very important subject. So they did all this work, and they brought out they completed a draft of this textbook. In the same year, another publisher took advantage of a new technology that allowed you to create multi-leveled textured covers for your textbook. And they had put on the cover of their new textbook a picture of a lizard that was actually bumpy, that you could feel the lizard. So my friend then had focus groups where these two books and a few others were presented to people who were going to be making these decisions about what textbooks to adopt. They were wiped out. My friend's book was completely wiped out by the bumpy lizard. People in the focus groups would gravitate toward the bumpy lizard. They would feel it. They would, their fingers would run along the edge of the bumpy lizard. And what was most interesting was this, that not only did people prefer the bumpy lizard book, but when asked on a questionnaire at the end of the focus groups, they would ascribe to the bumpy lizard book a lot of the attributes that it did not have. It was a completely traditional textbook, and that his book did have. But it didn't matter. It was the bumpy lizard all the way. That, I'm sad to say, is how consequential decisions are made for children, for students, in our education system, and have been made for many, many years. Is bumpy lizards, marketing, personal relationships between people who do marketing and people who are doing the purchasing decisions, and evidence hardly ever features into it. To say never would not be wrong by much. Why? Well, the people who do marketing are aware that there's a growing interest in the concept of evidence, but they have inoculated against this by presenting, marketers will always present some evidence that shows that their program is effective too. And it will be completely bogus, it will be something that will be a pre-post, it will be a single school that even if you call that school, you may find that was an unusual year. It may be based on extraordinary gains in a given year when the whole state made extraordinary gains because they changed tests or changed standards or something of that kind. But whatever it is extraordinarily unlikely to be a comparison between that program or that software or that book or that training model and a control group. But the people who hear this are not serious about research, or they even if they are serious, they say, well, it's going to take me all afternoon to track this down and find out whether this is true. I'm not really that well trained or that well equipped to make a discrimination between what this very nice marketing person is telling me and what I read somewhere else or some other marketing person is telling me. And so the decision will be made where people will say, well, the evidence kind of balances out, everybody's got evidence of effectiveness, but we'll make the decision on some other basis. And isn't that lizard bumpy? So that's the background in which you have to see what I'm about to talk to you about, is that there is now a beginning. We're nowhere near there, but there is now a beginning of a movement toward taking evidence seriously in education to help educators make consequential decisions that affect the lives of children. Now, I'm not the only person who says this. Here's a guy you may recognize who, even before he was president, said in The Audacity of Hope that one of the key principles that government should be espousing is to find reforms that have impact on achievement and fund them. And those that do not have an impact on achievement or that are harmful, to stop funding. That's an incredibly simple idea, but it's an incredibly powerful idea, and it's incredibly unusual for a public official even to say this. And then I will say that through direct White House involvement and through the OMB, and I'll talk about this in a moment, that he's largely followed through on this idea. Not nearly as completely as one might hope, but there's been enormous progress on this because of this vision that the current administration has expressed. And I should say that this is not completely unique. The George W. Bush administration also was trying to push evidence very ineptly, but they were trying, and that counts for something. Part of the problem here is in the nature of the way education works in America, and well, to some degree in other countries it has some similarities. The whole system of education is constantly churning. At the very top levels anyway, there is a constant process of change. Anything that becomes established, it becomes unestablished by the next administration, or it's cut back because of funding cutbacks or what have you. What's in the newspaper, what people debate about, are things that have to do with accountability and assessment, and which is, if you follow the education news, you'll see, just recently there was something where a state superintendent in Florida had to resign because he was jimmying the ratings for a charter school supported by a major Republican contributor to his campaign and others. But there's constant discussion about accountability and assessment, about governance. Should there be charter schools? Should there be contract schools? Should there be vouchers? Or should government run schools the way they always have? About teacher evaluation, I'm sure you're aware. Huge debate right now about requiring various kinds of evaluations of teachers and trying to then use the evaluations as part of a professional development for teachers. Don't get me going on that one. And then there's constant pendulum going back and forth between centralization and site-based management. We are just coming off of the maximum of the pendulum in terms of centralization, what I refer to as the genius superintendent model, which is assuming that there's some genius out there who's going to come and run your school system and make everything better, ignoring the fact that the average tenure of a superintendent is 2.5 years, and even geniuses have trouble making miracles in 2.5 years. But nevertheless, the people try centralization. They say, you know what, centralization is not getting us good results. Let's go back to site-based management, where you can look over a period decades and see this swing back and forth over time. All of these things go back and forth. They constantly are in turmoil and churning and making things different, but they don't make things better, by and large. Why do they not make things better? Because we don't ever stop and find out which ones of them are actually making any difference. And so each new government comes in and says, this is our policy, this is what we're going to do. And they do it, and then it doesn't turn out to be as effective or as positive as they'd hoped, and then the next group comes along and changes it completely. So this ended up looking more like a smiley face than like a pendulum, but see this, if you will, as a pendulum, which shouldn't be a smiley face. That's a bad thing. That, in a way, there are different fields, some of which are characterized by genuine change over time, by change that cannot be reversed except by new evidence. Medicine is the most obvious, but agriculture is another one, and anything relating to technology or engineering is another. These are fields in which there are big arguments, there are different opinions, and things do churn, they go back and forth in terms of opinions about various things, but eventually there's a winner. Eventually, the better evidence wins out, and that matters. And as a result, it's sloppy, it's slow, it's expensive, it's difficult, but the fields move forward. Then there are fields in which that does not take place. Fashion. Hemlines go up, hemlines go down, scarves are in, scarves are out. There are all sorts of things that happen in fashion, but nobody sees those things as advances. It's just that they're in because they're in, and then they go out because people are tired of them. In England, I don't know, I've never seen this here, but in England people are wearing these things called fascinators. And it's not a hat, it's like a twisted piece of metal on their head. And they use this is high fashion. You can predict, you can set your watch, and you know that fascinators will be gone. They're ugly, for one thing. I don't know if that matters, but that's how things work in fashion. That's how things work in art. We have a particular form of art that's considered popular, and then it goes out just because people are tired of it. And then there's education. Now, why should education be on that list? Unlike fashion and art, education can be measured. There's a legitimate argument about what measures are valid, and we can talk about that. But by and large, for many of the outcomes that we value in education, we can find out. Did this program reduce? Did it reduce dropout? Did it increase achievement? Did it reduce retentions or assignments to special education? Did it? We can find these things out. Those are legitimate outcomes in education. We can tell. Unlike fashion and art, where the one person's taste is just as valid as anyone else's. But yet, for years and years and years and years, education has been just like that, and therefore has been subject to the pendulum swing of fashion. Things are in because they're in, they're out just because they're not in anymore, rather than because there's evidence that's saying that they're no longer effective or never work. In any area where you don't operate by evidence, how do things get adopted? Actually, education is wonderfully receptive to every innovation that anybody ever wants to try in it. People in education are very eager to try new things. But the same people who are eager to try thing X are also eager to try thing Y and try thing Z. Because no one thing will ever accomplish everything, and if you're not paying any attention to the evidence, then the newness of something is the only thing that makes it attractive. I mean, it seems like fun. The kids like it. I mean, I remember years ago working in reading that overnight, every class in America somehow sprouted an empty bathtub. You remember that? or a loft. Teachers would come in over the weekend and they would build a loft in which kids, and the idea was that kids would, they'd put pillows in the bathtub, or they'd put pillows in the loft, and it would be a reading loft or a reading bathtub. And everybody had one of these things. It's not a bad idea. It's a perfectly, nice thing, and it says we value reading, and reading is fun, and it's, just kind of goofy in a certain way. But it was a fad. It swept the country in a very short time. A few years later, you didn't see any bathtubs or lofts. And that's exactly the way things go with fascinators and hemlines and scarves and so on. It's just like that, and that's the sort of thing. So how do things move in education? How does innovation get introduced? Word of mouth. Your friend down the road did something. You like their bathtub, you like their loft, you do that. Tradition, we've always done it this way. This is the way I was taught. Teachers, principals, superintendents in education. One of the problems of education is the very fact that everybody's been through it, so that they have a very clear sense of what's safe, what's appropriate in education, because what happened to them is what they considered to be safe and appropriate. That's why they went into education. The people who didn't do well in it or didn't like it went into something that pays better. Politics. The story I just told you about the state superintendent in Florida, who used to be state superintendent in Indiana. The fact that this was a Republican donor, he was a Republican. There was big issues, political issues that were at stake. And these things greatly affect how people make decisions. And then marketing, which I was talking about before. Think, don't be lizard. That's how change takes place in education. It's the way it has for a very long time, and if something doesn't change, it's the way it will for a much longer time into the future. This is what has to change. This is what evidence-based reform is trying to do. So, in the imagined world of evidence-based reform, what works is what matters. That you probably heard the expression that many educational leaders use, which is, in God we trust, all others bring data. Okay, well, some of you hadn't heard that. That's good. This data of a particular kind, that before we go around telling or suggesting to school districts to do this, that, or the other thing, we need to have tested it out. The concept here is modeled on, as I mentioned before, on medicine, agriculture, and engineering, and many other fields, in which there are, to greater or lesser degree, there are standards of what evidence needs to be, and there are even bodies like the Food and Drug Administration that enforce those standards and have legal consequences if you fail to enforce those, if you fail to adhere to those standards and then cause harm. And of course, education is not identical to those fields, but there are things you can learn from them in those regards. One of the things about evidence-based reform, and I'll say more about this, is that not only does evidence-based reform change things in terms of what is known now and trying to get schools to use things that have good evidence of effectiveness today, but it creates a dynamic of progressive improvement in which it all of a sudden becomes, if evidence matters, and people are making decisions based on real good evidence, then it becomes essential, first off, for people to evaluate that which they want to be used in schools, and secondly, it becomes worthwhile for academics, for government, for private funders, for private foundations, for commercial companies. All of them have an incentive to be creating new innovations that are likely to have positive impacts in high-quality research. That's something utterly lacking in education. There is absolutely no reason to do something in education today that is merely effective. If it's glitzy, if it's fancy, if people might buy it because it's super duper technology or whatever, you might make a case and you might be able to market it. But if it is merely effective, not a chance. And in a world in which the evidence does matter, then you have strong reason to be an innovator, to create new things, and to evaluate them, and to create things that you think will not merely look good, but actually be good, actually make a difference for children. So in this hypothetical world, you imagine that you have educators who are evaluating their needs in various formats and choosing among proven innovations with some confidence that whichever one of them they choose, that there's going to be good professional development, materials, capacity to provide these things to them, and that there might be incentive funding of one kind or another from government, federal, state, local, whoever, to help educators to implement proven interventions. Personally, I'm very opposed to the idea that any of these interventions, no matter how well validated, that they should not be mandated, they should not be forced on people. But there can be incentives or a few points on competitive preference points and applications and that sort of thing to make it so that people will want to implement these programs or practices or technologies or whatever they are, and have the wherewithal to do so. And then you need some kind of knowledge brokering, some assistance to help educators make good choices. Way back in the day, in the time of New American Schools, when there was comprehensive reform programs, New American Schools would arrange to have effective methods fairs in which educators could come and visit with lots of people who are providing lots of things that constituted comprehensive school reform. And people would have videos, and they'd have people there to talk to you, and they would have brochures, and then, so you could learn a lot and not have to go figure it out, fishing around on the internet to figure out which programs are sensible for your particular situation, or truly have the evidence that you're looking for, or make sense in terms of your resources or what have you. Now, just to be clear, let me point out a few things that sound like evidence-based reform, but are not. One that I mentioned is the mandating of practices that are supported by research. The problem with mandating is that it gets everybody's back up. You don't want to create a situation in which educators or politicians or others are feeling as though the research world is forcing them to do things. Much as I believe in evidence-based reform, I would have to say that the quality of evidence behind educational programs is very good at the best, but it's not at such a high level that it should be mandated, that it should be forced on anybody. And that then it would be much better to encourage it, continue to evaluate, so that over a period of time you get smarter and smarter about what does make sense and what does not. The second is providing teachers with general principles that are supported by research. This is more or less what happened in the Bush administration under Reading First, where there were 5 principles. Those of you who work in reading can probably rattle them off for me. But there was phonemic awareness, phonics, comprehension, vocabulary, fluency. Everybody could say those things, and teachers all went through workshops to learn to be able to recite those things, and they saw videos, and they had lots of things that this is now scientifically based reading research. Everything had to be scientifically based. But the reality is that if you provide teachers with general principles, They are likely to look at their own practice, what they're doing already, and say, got that, got that, got that, got that. I'm 100%. In other words, if the principles are not laid out in some detail, then the list is used as a way to validate current practice rather than as a way to move forward current practice. Asking educators to become researchers themselves. I think that this must be, the idea that every teacher must become a researcher in their own right must come from people from large universities and very, very, very small towns. There just aren't. The idea that every teacher needs to become a researcher is just not practical. There are 3 million teachers out there, thereabouts. I think there are more than that. And they're not all going to become researchers. That's not what they went into teaching to do. They're very, 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 very busy people doing very good things that they know how to do. There's no reason to try to jerk them into some other profession and make them into researchers on their own. That doesn't, researchers can be wonderful in terms of serving on research teams and helping research to be, rooted in reality. No question that teachers can make an enormous contribution. But the idea that each and every teacher needs to become a researcher is just neither practical nor likely to work. And similarly, asking every school to invent its own research-informed methods is usually a way to get them to reinvent that which they were already doing. Because again, that they just to get government off their back or whoever's giving them money to satisfy them, it's always nice to come up with something that actually just adds a few bathtubs and reading lofts to what you were already doing. Thank you very much. I mean, it's in any area of life. If you've ever tried to be on a diet plan or anything where you're doing self-improvement, the degree to which you're asked to make it up yourself is usually the degree to which you find ways to say, well, I'll leave out this, I'll change that to make it a little easier and fit my schedule better, and pretty soon you're doing whatever you were doing before because that's easiest. There are several things that are going on that are moving forward this evidence movement. One of them, the most important by far, is called Investing in Innovation, or I3. This is a giant program or was a giant program in its earliest days that was part of the Obama administration's ARRA. Actually, I've got slides on this. Let me just go through the list, and then I've got slides on each one separately. The second is the IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, that has been working hard at this over many years. The Education Endowment Foundation, which is in England, and is doing things very similar to I3. Edgar, and I'll tell you about the tales of Edgar. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is essentially the White House expressing the opinion that relates to the quote that I gave you, that evidence should play a major role in education, and a number of other developments. So, let me talk about investing in innovation. So it began as part of ARRA, the Recovery Act, and what it does is provides what's called tiered funding. Tiered meaning that that programs with very strong evidence can get very strong funding. Programs with modest evidence can get modest funding. Programs with no evidence can try out their ideas and try to build up an evidence base over a period of time. So the little ones are called development, and those were originally $5 million over 5 years. Now they're $3 million a year. $3 million over 5 years. Then validation, which originally was $30 million, and scale up. So validation, you could get a validation grant if you had a single high-quality study that would meet at least the accepted with reservation standard of the What Works Clearinghouse. And basically the purpose of a validation is to get ready for scale up, is to do the definitive third-party randomized evaluation that you should have done earlier, but didn't have the money for, and then take your program to scale. Scale-ups are programs that have already had, in general, at least 2 such studies, and have indicated a capacity to work at large scale. So far, there are 92 of these projects that have been funded, and there is a review process going on right now that will add another 20 or so. And they've spent about $1.1 billion. In education, we never see a B at the start of any dollar sign, thing following a dollar sign that has to do with research or development or anything of the kind. So this is utterly extraordinary. In other words, I3 all by itself has spent more than IES has spent, probably over its entire existence. At the moment, it's now at the level of 150 million per year. So IES is spending more than I3, but I3 has started off with a lot more than that. In these 92 projects, most of which are development, many of which are validation, only 5 of which are scale-up, 2 of which are run by us, so it's, just so you know. There's a wide variety of kinds of programs. They are related to reading and math, science and social studies. There's an art project. There's things that are very much in a what would you say, in a Dewey and mold. There are things that are quite the opposite of that. Really quite a substantial variety of kinds of programs united by an interest and capacity to go to scale and a willingness to be subjected to third-party evaluation. These third-party evaluations for the validations and scale-ups are always large and randomized. And they can provide a lot of assistance in terms of taking something from a research stance and bringing it to scale. I think those of you who work in education and research are aware of the Institute for Education Sciences that has been slowly trying to build up studies of this kind. What it has done so to some degree, but particularly has had a massive impact in terms of building up the skill set in the whole field of education research to do the kinds of studies that are needed for I3. So to do something like I3 before IES existed would have been impossible because not many people knew how to use HLM or to do large-scale randomized evaluations. I won't tell you about EEF, that's unless you're English. You can ask me afterward. Nobody's excited about this quite except for me and a few very, very weird people in government. But this could be extremely important. EDGAR is the basic regulation framework that is used in the U.S. Department of Education. And into EDGAR is being inserted definitions of moderate and strong evidence of effectiveness. And those definitions, once established, can be used for anything. They can be used for legislation, they can be used for RFPs, and I think that just having those definitions there create lots of possibilities for making evidence important. I mentioned the OMB. I won't say more about it. And there are a number of related developments in other areas that you can ask me about. This could all go wrong. And in the history of education, research, and development, it probably will. But though I'm optimistic, but you can see where things could go wrong. First off, there could be too few programs that meet a high standard. Some of the ones that do meet a high standard may not go to scale. There's already criticisms that in order to get to the level where you could qualify for scale-up funding, you've got to be old. And so a lot of the things that are presented as innovations are seen as, well, that's not an innovation, that's been around for 20 years. And then, of course, academics being academics, they're going to fight with each other about all of these definitions and research methods and findings and everything else. So, my message to you is not one that says that we're there, but I would like you I would hope that as education researchers, as people interested in education policy, as people who care about kids, that you would, from this conversation, help to share this vision of people in education making choices among proven programs and practices, building up a much more robust research and development enterprise, of having networks of schools that are using similar kinds of methods that are supporting each other and helping each other refine proven programs, and of targeted funding from government that focuses on where the evidence is. And so let me stop and use the remaining time for questions, comments, concerns, and that sort of thing. Yes?
So I'm a bit concerned that the nature of the phenomenon is quite different. You know, agriculture and engineering, medicine is kind of in between, but focusing on complex living systems seems very different. So I'm just wondering if we have, are we learning anything comparable to this from research on psychotherapy, or research on leadership, or research on affected families, areas in which people are trying to understand complex living systems, where, you know, there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of multivariate, nonlinear phenomenon. Is this really a kind of a realistic analogy when you look at these other people?
In different parts of education, it's more realistic than it is in others. Just as, for example, if you take psychotherapy, I think that there are methods of psychotherapy that lend themselves, or kinds of outcomes that you might see that lend themselves to this sort of thing. And there are lots of very high quality randomized evaluations that have found effective and ineffective forms of, for example, parent training. If you know about the Incredible Years program, it's one example, and then there's numerous other ones. So it is not at all impossible to identify areas of education. I mean, if you think about, you want to teach algebra to 8th or 9th graders. There's a clear sense about what algebra should be, what the outcome should be. There's no reason that you couldn't do development, evaluation, dissemination of something of that kind. If you say, what makes effective principles? Maybe not. I'm not sure that this paradigm works for absolutely everything even within education, but there are so many areas in which it does, where there are pretty clear processes that could be replicated and could be, evaluated and scaled up, that I think it should be on the table. This is not prescribing what kind of research to be done. There's lots more that we can learn from the whole process along the way. But in terms of what, at the very end, we're able to say to people and say, you want to improve algebra? We've got some strategies you might want to take a look at. You're concerned about everybody reading by 3rd grade? We should, these are things that you might want to take a look at. What if, if you've got kids who are well-defined position on the autistic spectrum, here are some strategies that might be effective for these kids. That's the kind of thing that, the questions that can be readily answered.
It impresses me the extent to which your questions embody a rather specific goal, where people could legitimately share the goal of being better in algebra or reading more proficiently. There are sort of higher order goals of education that are not so agreed upon.
Right.
Like social responsibility is a goal of education. Some might see that as paramount and others might see it as that's outside the scope of what schools should be involved in. So I'm assuming that the more you can define what the desired outcome is, the better this model is going to work.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But if you think about medicine, if you think of, if you say, you've got this particular kind of heart disease, the goal is clear, and you can try different alternative ways of solving it, then the research there applies very effectively. If you ask, how should hospitals be designed to serve a rural community? Not so much. And they have the same problems we have when you ask a question of that kind. So the fact that we have, dandy methods for some things shouldn't limit our goals. We have to use the appropriate kinds of ways to learn for each of the kinds of problems that we're going to be presented with. But there are so many circumstances for which we could answer good questions with good solutions that we shouldn't ignore them just because they can't answer every problem that we may be thrown. Yes?
I'm wondering, everything you said makes me think there's a huge need for change in teacher education. And I've been in education for over 25 years, having started as a classroom teacher. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on what your thoughts are about changing teacher preparation.
Well, I think that the teacher preparation, unfortunately, has to follow changes that are taking place in the schools. If you train your students, your teacher preparation students, in the very, very best evidence-based methods, and no school anywhere around uses those things, then you're probably not doing them a service. Neither them nor the schools into which they go. So in a sense, I think that as this kind of work goes forward and you begin to change schools at a large scale, then it's going to change, it should change teacher education in terms of preparing teachers to work in those kinds of schools, but not probably in the other direction.
I saw one more hand.
There's been a lot of work on using evidence to evaluate effectively procedures and programs once they get established. What about, do you think we're making progress in using evidence to test and debug the theories that are used to design the programs in the first place?
Well, of course, that's what educational psychology has been at for a long time, is to try to advance the theoretical base and to get, these programs don't come into existence out of nowhere. They draw on the smaller scale, fine-tuned research that educational psychologists have been doing for a very long time. And I hope that that continuum will grow and will provide more respect for more basic research and for more theoretically driven research as you develop more and more capacity to take good basic research and make it into things that matter. Just as has happened in medicine, there is way more respect for things that could not possibly benefit anybody, but are moving forward techniques or theories or basic biological processes because people have seen that those advances do ultimately affect things at the next level that can save your grandpa's life.
I think we're almost out of time. Any more questions?